Scene 1, Chapter 4 of No Name. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Griffiths. No Name by Wilkie Collins. Scene 1, Chapter 4. No new revelations came back with them. No anticipations associated with their return were realized. On the one forbidden subject of their errand in London, there was no moving either the master or the mistress of the house. Whatever their object might have been, they had, to all appearance, successfully accomplished it, for they both returned in perfect possession of their everyday looks and manners. Mrs. Vanstone's spirits had subsided to their natural quiet level. Mr. Vanstone's imperturbable cheerfulness sat as easily and indolently on him as usual. This was the one noticeable result of their journey. This, and no more. Had the household revolution run its course already? Was the secret thus far hidden impenetrably, hidden for ever? Nothing in this world is hidden for ever. The gold which has lain for centuries unsuspected in the ground reveals itself one day on the surface. Sand turns traitor, and betrays the footstep that has passed over it. Water gives back to the telltale surface the body that has been drowned. Fire itself leaves the confession, in ashes, of the substance consumed in it. Hate breaks its prison secrecy in the thoughts through the doorway of the eyes, and love finds the Judas who betrays it by a kiss. Look where we will, the inevitable law of revelation is one of the laws of nature. The lasting preservation of a secret is a miracle which the world has never yet seen. How was the secret now hidden in the household at Combe Raven doomed to disclose itself? Through what coming event in the daily lives of the father, the mother, and the daughters was the law of revelation destined to break the fatal way to discovery? The way opened, unseen by the parents and unsuspected by the children, through the first event that happened after Mr. and Mrs. Vanstone's return. An event which presented, on the surface of it, no interest of greater importance than the trivial social ceremony of a morning call. 3 days after the master and mistress of Combe Raven had come back, the female members of the family happened to be assembled together in the morning room. The view from the windows looked over the flower garden and shrubbery, this last being protected at its outward extremity by a fence, and approached from the lane beyond by a wicket gate. During an interval in the conversation, the attention of the ladies was suddenly attracted to this gate by the sharp sound of the iron latch falling in its socket. Someone had entered the shrubbery from the lane, and Magdalen at once placed herself at the window to catch the first sight of the visitor through the trees. After a few minutes the figure of a gentleman became visible at the point where the shrubbery path joined the winding garden walk which led to the house. Magdalen looked at him attentively, without appearing, at first, to know who he was. As he came nearer, however, she started in astonishment, and, turning quickly to her mother and sister, proclaimed the gentleman in the garden to be no other than Mr. Francis Clare. The visitor thus announced was the son of Mr. Vanstone's oldest associate and nearest neighbour. Mr. Clare the elder inhabited an unpretending little cottage, situated just outside the shrubbery fence which marked the limit of the Combe Raven grounds. Belonging to the younger branch of a family of great antiquity, the one inheritance of importance that he had derived from his ancestors was the possession of a magnificent library, which not only filled all the rooms in his modest little dwelling, but lined the staircases and passages as well. Mr. Clare's books represented the one important interest of Mr. Clare's life. He had been a widower for many years past, and made no secret of his philosophical resignation to the loss of his wife. As a father, he regarded his family of 3 sons in the light of a necessary domestic evil which perpetually threatened the sanctity of his study and the safety of his books. When the boys went to school, Mr. Clare said good-bye to them and thanked God to himself. As for his small income, and his still smaller domestic establishment, He looked at them both from the same satirically indifferent point of view. He called himself a pauper with a pedigree. He abandoned the entire direction of his household to the slatternly old woman who was his only servant, on the condition that she was never to venture near his books with a duster in her hand from one year's end to the other. His favorite poets were Horace and Pope, his chosen philosophers Hobbes and Voltaire. He took his exercise and his fresh air under protest, and always walked the same distance to a yard on the ugliest high road in the neighborhood. He was crooked of back and quick of temper. He could digest radishes and sleep after green tea. His views of human nature were the views of Diogenes, tempered by Rochefoucauld. His personal habits were slovenly in the last degree, and his favorite boast was that he had outlived all human prejudices. Such was this singular man in his more superficial aspects. What nobler qualities he might possess below the surface, no one had ever discovered. Mr. Vanstone, it is true, stoutly asserted that Mr. Clare's worst side was his outside, but in this expression of opinion he stood alone among his neighbors. The association between these two widely dissimilar men had lasted for many years, and was almost close enough to be called a friendship. They had acquired a habit of meeting to smoke together on certain evenings in the week, in the cynic philosopher's study, and of their disputing on every imaginable subject, Mr. Vanstone flourishing the stout cudgels of assertion, and Mr. Clare meeting him with the keen-edged tools of sophistry. They generally quarrelled at night, and met on the neutral ground of the shrubbery, to be reconciled together the next morning. The bond of intercourse thus curiously established between them was strengthened on Mr. Vanstone's side by a hearty interest in his neighbour's 3 sons, an interest by which those sons benefited all the more importantly, seeing that one of the prejudices which their father had outlived was a prejudice in favour of his own children. "I look at those boys," the philosopher was accustomed to say, "with a perfectly impartial eye. I dismiss the unimportant accident of their birth from all consideration, and I find them below the average in every respect." Fortunately for the boys, Mr. Vanstone's views were still fast imprisoned in the ordinary prejudices. At his intercession, and through his influence, Frank, Cecil, and Arthur were received on the foundation of a well-reputed grammar school. In holiday time they were mercifully allowed the run of Mr. Vanstone's paddock, and were humanized and refined by association indoors with Mrs. Vanstone and her daughters. On these occasions Mr. Clare used sometimes to walk across from his cottage, in his dressing-gown and slippers, and look at the boys disparagingly through the window or over the fence, as if they were 3 wild animals whom his neighbour was attempting to tame. "You and your wife are excellent people," he used to say to Mr. Vanstone. "I respect your honest prejudices in favor of those boys of mine with all my heart, but you are so wrong about them, you are indeed. I wish to give no offense. I speak quite impartially, but mark my words, Vanstone, they'll all 3 turn out ill, in spite of everything you can do to prevent it." In later years, when Frank had reached the age of 17, the same curious shifting of the relative positions of parent and friend between the 2 neighbors was exemplified more absurdly than ever. A civil engineer in the north of England, who owned certain obligations to Mr. Vanstone, expressed his willingness to take Frank under superintendence on terms of the most favorable kind. When this proposal was received, Mr. Clare, as usual, first shifted his own character as Frank's father on Mr. Vanstone's shoulders, and then moderated his neighbor's parental enthusiasm from the point of view of an impartial spectator. "It's the finest chance for Frank that could possibly have happened," cried Mr. Vanstone, in a glow of fatherly enthusiasm. "My good fellow, he won't take it," retorted Mr. Clare, with the icy composure of a disinterested friend. "But he shall take it," persisted Mr. Vanstone. "Say he shall have a mathematical head, rejoined Mr. Clare. "Say he shall possess industry, ambition, and firmness of purpose. Pooh, pooh! You don't look at him with my impartial eyes. I say no mathematics, no industry, no ambition, no firmness of purpose. Frank is a compound of negatives, and there they are." "Hang your negatives!" shouted Mr. Vanstone. "I don't care a rush for negatives or affirmatives either. Frank shall have this splendid chance, and I'll lay you any wager you like he makes the best of it." "I'm not rich enough to lay wagers usually," replied Mr. Clare. "But I think I've got a guinea about the house somewhere, and I'll lay you that guinea Frank comes back on our hands like a bad shilling." "Done!" said Mr. Vanstone. "No, stop a minute. I won't do the lad's character the injustice of backing it at even money. I'll lay you 5-1 Frank turns up trumps in this business. You ought to be ashamed of yourself for talking of him as you do. What sort of hocus-pocus you bring it about by, I don't pretend to know, but you always end in making me take his part, as if I was his father instead of you." "Ah, yes, give you time and you'll defend yourself. I won't give you time. I won't have any of your special pleading. Black's white according to you. I don't care. It's black for all that. You may talk 19 to the dozen. I shall write to my friend and say yes, in Frank's interests, by today's post." Such were the circumstances under which Mr. Francis Clare departed for the north of England at the age of 17 to start in life as a civil engineer. From time to time Mr. Vanstone's friend communicated with him on the subject of the new pupil. Frank was praised as a quiet, gentlemanlike, interesting lad, but he was also reported to be rather slow at acquiring the rudiments of engineering science. Other letters, later in date, described him as a little too ready to despond about himself, as having been sent away on that account to some new railway works, to see if change of scene would rouse him, and as having benefited in every respect by the experiment, except perhaps in regard to his professional studies, which still advanced but slowly. Subsequent communications announced his departure, under care of a trustworthy foreman, for some public works in Belgium, touched on the general benefit he appeared to derive from this new change, praised his excellent manners and address, which were of great assistance in facilitating business communications with the foreigners, and passed over in ominous silence the main question of his actual progress in the acquirement of knowledge. These reports, and many others which resembled them, were all conscientiously presented by Frank's friend to the attention of Frank's father. On each occasion Mr. Clare exulted over Mr. Vanstone, and Mr. Vanstone quarrelled with Mr. Clare. "One of these days you'll wish you hadn't laid that wager," said the cynic philosopher. "One of these days I shall have the blessed satisfaction of pocketing your guinea," cried the sanguine friend. 2 years had then passed since Frank's departure. In 1 year more results asserted themselves, and settled the question. 2 days after Mr. Vanstone's return from London, he was called away from the breakfast table before he had found time enough to look over his letters, delivered by the morning's post. Thrusting them into one of the pockets of his shooting jacket, he took the letters out again at one grasp, to read them when the occasion served, later in the day. The grasp included the whole correspondence with one exception, that exception being a final report from the civil engineer, which notified the termination of the connection between his pupil and himself, and the immediate return of Frank to his father's house. While this important announcement lay unsuspected in Mr. Vanstone's pocket, the object of it was travelling home as fast as railways could take him. At 10:30 at night, while Mr. Clare was sitting in studious solitude over his books and his green tea, with his favourite black cat to keep him company, he heard footsteps in the passage. The door opened, and Frank stood before him. Ordinary men would have been astonished, but the philosopher's composure was not to be shaken by any such trifle as the unexpected return of his eldest son. He could not have looked up more calmly from his learned volume if Frank had been absent for 3 minutes instead of 3 years. "Exactly what I predicted," said Mr. Clare. "Don't interrupt me by making explanations, and don't frighten the cat. If there is anything to eat in the kitchen, get it, and go to bed. You can walk over to Combe Raven tomorrow and give this message from me to Mr. Vanstone. Father's compliments, sir, and I have come back upon your hands like a bad shilling, as he always said I should. He keeps his own guinea and takes your 5, and he hopes you'll mind what he says to you another time. That is the message. Shut the door after you. Good night." Under these unfavorable auspices, Mr. Francis Clare made his appearance the next morning in the grounds at Combe Raven, and, something doubtful of the reception that might await him, slowly approached the precincts of the house. It was not wonderful that Magdalen should have failed to recognize him when he first appeared in view. He had gone away a backward lad of 17. He returned a young man of 20. His slim figure had now acquired strength and grace, and had increased in stature to the medium height. The small, regular features which he was supposed to have inherited from his mother were rounded and filled out, without having lost their remarkable delicacy of form. His beard was still in its infancy, and nascent lines of whisker traced their modest way sparely down his cheeks. His gentle, wandering brown eyes would have looked to better advantage in a woman's face. They wanted spirit and firmness to fit them for the face of a man. His hands had the same wandering habit as his eyes. They were constantly changing from one position to another, constantly twisting and turning any little stray thing they could pick up. He was undeniably handsome, graceful, well-bred, but no close observer could look at him without suspecting that the stout old family stock had begun to wear out in the latest generations, and that Mr. Francis Clare had more in him of the shadow of his ancestors than of the substance. When the astonishment caused by his appearance had partially subsided, a search was instituted for the missing report. It was found in the remotest recesses of Mr. Vanstone's capacious pocket, and was read by that gentleman on the spot. The plain facts, as stated by the engineer, were briefly these. Frank was not possessed of the necessary abilities to fit him for his new calling, and it was useless to waste time by keeping him any longer in an employment for which he had no vocation. This, after 3 years' trial, being the conviction on both sides, the master had thought it the most straightforward course for the pupil to go home and candidly place the results before his father and his friends. In some pursuit for which he was more fit, and in which he could feel an interest, he would no doubt display the industry and perseverance which he had been too much discouraged to practice in the profession that he had now abandoned. Personally, he was liked by all who knew him, and his future prosperity was heartily desired by the many friends whom he had made in the North. Such was the substance of the report, and so it came to an end. Many men would have thought the engineer's statement rather too carefully worded, and, suspecting him of trying to make the best of a bad case, would have entertained serious doubts on the subject of Frank's future. Mr. Vanstone was too easy-tempered and sanguine, and too anxious as well not to yield his old antagonist an inch more ground than he could help, to look at the letter from any such unfavorable point of view. Was it Frank's fault if he had not got the stuff in him that engineers were made of? Did no other young men ever begin life with a false start? Plenty began in that way, and got over it, and did wonders afterwards. With these commentaries on the letter, the kind-hearted gentleman patted Frank on the shoulder. "Cheer up, my lad," said Mr. Vanstone. "We will be even with your father one of these days, though he has won the wager this time." The example thus set by the master of the house was followed at once by the family, with the solitary exception of Norah, whose incurable formality and reserve expressed themselves, not too graciously, in her distant manner toward the visitor. The rest, led by Magdalen, who had been Frank's favorite playfellow in past times, glided back into their old easy habits with him without an effort. He was frank with all of them but Norah, who persisted in addressing him as Mr. Clare. Even the account he was now encouraged to give of the reception accorded to him by his father on the previous night failed to disturb Norah's gravity. She sat with her dark, handsome face steadily averted, her eyes cast down, and the rich color in her cheeks warmer and deeper than usual. All the rest, Miss Garth included, found old Mr. Clare's speech of welcome to his son quite irresistible. The noise and merriment were at their height when the servant came in and struck the whole party dumb by the announcement of visitors in the drawing-room. Mr. Marrable, Mrs. Marrable, and Miss Marrable, Evergreen Lodge, Clifton. Norah rose as readily as if the new arrivals had been a relief to her mind. Mrs. Vanstone was the next to leave her chair. These two went away first to receive the visitors. Magdalen, who preferred the society of her father and Frank, pleaded hard to be left behind. But Miss Garth, after granting 5 minutes' grace, took her into custody and marched her out of the room. Frank rose to take his leave. "No, no," said Mr. Vanstone, detaining him. "Don't go. These people won't stop long. Mr. Marrable's a merchant at Bristol. I've met him once or twice, when the girls forced me to take them to parties at Clifton. Mere acquaintances, nothing more. Come and smoke a cigar in the greenhouse. Hang all visitors, they worry one's life out. I'll appear at the last moment with an apology, and you shall follow me at a safe distance, and be a proof that I was really engaged." Proposing this ingenious stratagem in a confidential whisper, Mr. Vanstone took Frank's arm and led him round the house by the back way. The first 10 minutes of seclusion in the conservatory passed without events of any kind. At the end of that time a flying figure in bright garments flashed upon the two gentlemen through the glass. The door was flung open, flower pots fell in homage to passing petticoats, and Mr. Vanstone's youngest daughter ran up to him at headlong speed, with every external appearance of having suddenly taken leave of her senses. "Papa, the dream of my whole life is realized," she said, as soon as she could speak. "I shall fly through the roof of the greenhouse if somebody doesn't hold me down. The Marrables have come here with an invitation. Guess, you darling, guess what they're going to give at Evergreen Lodge." "A ball," said Mr. Vanstone, without a moment's hesitation. "Private theatricals!" cried Magdalen, her clear young voice ringing through the conservatory like a bell, her loose sleeves falling back and showing her round white arms to the dimpled elbows as she clapped her hands ecstatically in the air. "The Rivals is the play, Papa, The Rivals, by the famous What's-his-name, and they want me to act. The one thing in the whole universe that I long to do most. It all depends on you." Mamma shakes her head, and Miss Garth looks daggers, and Norah's as sulky as usual. "But if you say yes, they must all three give way and let me do as I like. Say yes," she pleaded, nestling softly up to her father and pressing her lips with a fond gentleness to his ear as she whispered the next words. "Say yes, and I'll be a good girl for the rest of my life." "A good girl?" repeated Mr. Vanstone. "A mad girl, I think you must mean. Hang these people and their theatricals! I shall have to go indoors and see about this matter. You needn't throw away your cigar, Frank. You're well out of the business, and you can stop here." "No, he can't," said Magdalen. "He's in the business too." Mr. Francis Clare had hitherto remained modestly in the background. He now came forward with a face expressive of speechless amazement. "Yes," continued Magdalen, answering his blank look of inquiry with perfect composure, "you are to act. Miss Marrable and I have a turn for business, and we settled it all in 5 minutes. There are 2 parts in the play left to be filled. One is Lucy, the waiting maid, which is the character I have undertaken, with papa's permission," she added, slyly pinching her father's arm. "And he won't say no, will he? First, because he's a darling. Secondly, because I love him, and he loves me. And thirdly, because there is never any difference of opinion between us, is there? Fourthly, because I give him a kiss, which naturally stops his mouth and settles the whole question. Dear me, I'm wondering, where was I just now? Oh, yes, explaining myself to Frank. "I beg your pardon," began Frank, attempting at this point to enter his protest. "The second character in the play," pursued Magdalen, without taking the smallest notice of the protest, "is Falkland, a jealous lover, with a fine flow of language. Miss Marrable and I discussed Falkland privately on the window-seat while the rest were talking. She is a delightful girl, so impulsive, so sensible, so entirely unaffected. She confided in me. She said, 'One of our miseries is that we can't find a gentleman who will grapple with the hideous difficulties of Falkland.' Of course I soothed her. Of course I said, 'I've got the gentleman, and he shall grapple immediately.' Oh, heavens, who is he? Mr. Francis Clare. And where is he? In the house at this moment. Will you be so very charming, Miss Vanstone, as to fetch him?" "I'll fetch him, Miss Marrable, with the greatest pleasure. I left the window seat. I rushed into the morning room. I smelled cigars. I followed the smell, and here I am." "It's a compliment, I know, to be asked to act," said Frank, in great embarrassment. "But I hope you and Miss Marrable will excuse me." "Certainly not. Miss Marrable and I are both remarkable for the firmness of our characters. When we say Mr. So-and-so is positively to act the part of Falkland, we positively mean it. Come in and be introduced." "But I never tried to act. I don't know how." "Not of the slightest consequence. If you don't know how, come to me and I'll teach you." "You!" exclaimed Mr. Vanstone. "What do you know about it?" "Pray, papa, be serious. I have the strongest internal conviction that I could act every character in the play, Falkland included. Don't let me have to speak a second time, Frank. Come and be introduced." She took her father's arm and moved on with him to the door of the greenhouse. At the steps she turned and looked round to see if Frank was following her. It was only the action of a moment, but in that moment her natural firmness of will rallied all its resources, strengthened itself with the influence of her beauty, commanded and conquered. She looked lovely. The flush was tenderly bright in her cheeks. The radiant pleasure shone and sparkled in her eyes. The position of her figure, turned suddenly from the waist upward, disclosed its delicate strength, its supple firmness, its seductive serpentine grace. "Come," she said, with a coquettish beckoning action of her head. "Come, Frank." Few men of 40 would have resisted her at that moment. Frank was 20 last birthday. In other words, he threw aside his cigar and followed her out of the greenhouse. As he turned and closed the door, in the instant when he lost sight of her, his disinclination to be associated with the private theatricals revived. At the foot of the house steps he stopped again, plucked a twig from a plant near him, broke it in his hand, and looked about him uneasily, on this side and on that. The path to the left led back to his father's cottage. The way of escape lay open. Why not take it? While he still hesitated, Mr. Vanstone and his daughter reached the top of the steps. Once more Magdalen looked round, looked with her resistless beauty, with her all-conquering smile. She beckoned again, and again he followed her, up the steps and over the threshold. The door closed on them. So, with a trifling gesture of invitation on one side, with a trifling act of compliance on the other, so, with no knowledge in his mind, with no thought in hers, of the secret still hidden under the journey to London, they took the way which led to that secret's discovery, through many a darker winding that was yet to come. End of Chapter 4. The first scene.